So welcome everybody. What we're going to cover today is some year-end security considerations for NetSuite. So as we reach the end of the calendar year, some key areas that you might want to look at, as well as some considerations that you're going to have going into next year. So basically, at the end of the year, when you have your external auditors coming in, really what they want to know is that your administrators understand and have control of your NetSuite system. And that's really going to be who has access to your system, what those users can do, who your power users are, so your administrator or full access users, and then is your security set up correctly? Do you have orphaned users? Are roles and permissions assigned correctly? And then really digging into processes and customizations that are going to deal with security as well. So that's really what we're going to cover today. First off, we'll talk a little bit about end-of-year journal entries, why they're important, what you can look for in NetSuite to identify, as well as what kind of approval workflows are available in NetSuite. We'll talk a little bit about segregation of duties, again, why they're important, some steps that you can take in your NetSuite environment to identify any risks that you might have. We'll look at user security. Basically, at a high level, that's who your users are and what they can do within your NetSuite environment and how that's going to apply to your roles and permission setup. Talk a little bit about administrator as well as full access users. They're kind of special users or special roles in NetSuite that can be assigned to users. We'll talk a little bit about some safeguards that you need to have in place for those users. Orphaned users, so users that have left NetSuite but might still have access to the system, obviously a big concern. Customizations and how those are going to apply to your security, as well as processes and what to look for there. So first off, end of year journal entries. So typically at the end of a calendar year, there's going to be a lot of journal entries that are going to get put into your financial system, which is going to be NetSuite. It can be for a number of reasons, from fixing accruals, deferrals, setting up bad debts, or adjusting depreciation on your assets. Because there is a large amount of journal entries that are entered at the end of the year, this is often a place where it's easy to hide improper entries, and also where you can manipulate end-of-year financial statements. So with that in mind, it is one of the first places that auditors are going to look, so it's going to be a key concern for both your auditors as well as your organization. First off, we recommend that you have a good grip on what journal entries have been entered into NetSuite at the end of the year. So some easy ways to do that in NetSuite, the first, probably the easiest way is really just save searches. Pretty easily build those out to get an understanding of journal entries that were created, what periods they were posted to. Were there any posted to periods that were locked at some point and have been reopened? That's obviously going to be a concern. When they were last modified, which users are going in and modifying as well as creating them, and then if you have approval processes in place on your journal entries, which is always a good idea, who has gone in and actually approved these journal entries. You can also use the standard audit trail in NetSuite that's just available. It's pretty much similar to a save search, but it's a little bit easier because it provides some filters on the page that you can easily use to identify journal entries. And then you can always look, when you're building out your save searches as well, I'd recommend linking from the journal entry over to system notes. That's going to give you field level detail on exactly who is modifying the exact fields on the journal entry. With approval workflows, there's really a couple different ways to set up approvals within NetSuite for journal entries. One is more of the basic approach, which is the require approval setting under your accounting preferences. Really all that does is add an approve or approval checkbox to the journal entry. Again, it's kind of a bare bones approach. To actually approve those journal entries at that point requires the journal approval permission in NetSuite. The second approach is a SuiteFlow based solution, and that's called approval routing. Once that's turned on, at that point it overrides the require approval setting. and you have to build your own approval process using SuiteFlow to actually determine who needs to approve journals, and then also if there's a hierarchy of approvals that are required. NetSuite does provide some templates for the approval routing feature that you can easily download or create when you're or use, I'm sorry, when you're creating a new approval workflow. Then it's always important, if you do have an approval workflow in place, that process should be fully documented. There shouldn't be any questions as to why a certain user was required to approve a journal. It should all be known up front. So on to segregation of duties. Essentially, segregation of duties, right, is having more than a single person required to complete a given task. So as it applies to NetSuite, when you talk about your AP process, having one user go through and have access to that entire process probably is not a good idea. It's always important to have multiple users involved throughout that process. And really, this is all about just managing risk. The more ways there are to do something, the more risk that it's not done correctly or with the proper approval there's going to be. So here we're trying to identify any excessive user access that you might have in your system. So again, it's going to be those users that have access to the entire process. That's going to elevate your risk of errors, fraud, and misstatements. So the first step here, there's basically 3 steps to segregation of duties. First step here is build out a rule set of your potential conflicts. So how do you determine where you have risk? Essentially, if somebody has access to given permissions, when you combine those permissions together, that's what's going to create your risk. It's important to understand up front what you consider your conflicts and what risk level you have attached to those conflicts. From there, you actually need to identify your conflicts, right? So we know what our risks or how we define risk, but where do we have risk in the system at this point? And really, in NetSuite, your best friend is going to be safe searches. You can run safe searches in NetSuite on the employees to get their permissions as well as their access levels. Those are just fields that exist when you run a safe search against employees. And then you can run it against roles as well. Roles, again, you can get the permission, you can get the access level. With employees, that's going to include global permissions as well. Once we've identified them, at that point, it's our next step, which is what are we doing about that risk, or how are we mitigating that risk? So making sure that you're documenting each conflict mitigation and understanding whether or not that mitigation is effective or not. So it's a pretty difficult thing to do in NetSuite. Again, you're going to be using multiple safe searches, having to combine those safe searches with Excel. This can get extremely difficult when you start to include global permissions. There's many roles per user, or if you have multiple subsidiaries. With roles in the employee setup, you can determine which subsidiaries a given user has access to, which can often make it difficult when analyzing user access in NetSuite. And then with global permissions, understanding how exactly those work. Global permissions override or take precedence over permissions that are identified in roles. So that's important to understand, and also makes it a little more difficult to analyze segregation of duties directly in NetSuite. So our suggestion is consider a third-party option for this. So user security, so at a high level, it's basically, what can your users do, who can do that, basically what roles, what permissions are assigned to users, and what goal permissions are assigned as well. So as we said earlier, you can determine what permissions each employee has by running a fairly simple employee safe search, which is going to return you back the permission as well as the level. It's important in this case to understand global permissions as well. Like I said, they do take precedence over role permissions, and they can be used to restrict access. So keep that in mind. If you create a role and set the vendor's permission to full, assign that role to an employee, and then create a global permission on that employee with the vendor's permission set to view, at that point that user is only going to have view access to vendors when they're logging into NetSuite. This is a common audit area. Every time your external auditors come in, they're going to ask you about user security, and they're going to ask you to conduct access reviews, typically on a very regular basis, whether that's bi-weekly, monthly, or maybe even quarterly. One important thing to note here is NetSuite access reports are missing the administrator and full access roles. So they don't show up when you're running employee permission searches. Those roles do not show up when you're running role searches as well against permissions. So diving into a little more to administrator and full access users, these are your power users within NetSuite. So some special consideration is going to need to be given to these users. It's best to minimize the administrator and full access users. It really is an excessive permission. With administrators, you have access to every single thing within NetSuite. NetSuite typically recommends you have to have at least 2 administrators, just in case one of those users is gone and somebody with the admin access is needed. But any more than that and very special and careful consideration needs to be given. So again, these users do not show up in user permission reports, and it can be extremely difficult to audit changes made by users that have the administrator or full access role. When looking at system notes in NetSuite or the audit trail in NetSuite, one thing that's often you'll notice is missing is the role that the user was logged in as when they made that change. So users with administrator that just have that role for a very limited period of time, perhaps in the firefighter role or as a firefighter that needs to be logged into NetSuite in order to fix some critical issue, it can be a little difficult to track the exact changes they're making with those roles. So again, always a best practice to minimize administrator and full access. And then as far as the users that do have those roles, it's important to manage that access. So the first step there is going to be your password policies. Out of the box, NetSuite's password policy is set to strong, which requires special characters as well as numbers to be entered in with a password. It's best to just leave that as strong. There's really no reason to make that any less, especially considering the level of access that admins and full access users have. And then your password length, it's important to make sure you set that as well. I would suggest anything above 8. And then also password expiration. Password expiration is not set by default. By default, the only users that passwords expire for are users who can view unencrypted credit card data, which is set to 90 days expiration. I would highly suggest setting a password expiration policy because that's going to catch you in the case of these users that leave and you forget to remove their access to NetSuite. Also, I would not recommend using the administrator or full access roles for service accounts. So if you have integrations in place that are accessing NetSuite data, you'll often hear of those integrators just requiring the administrator role. That's really just them being lazy for the most part. Usually the data that they're going to be accessing through web services or through Suite Analytics Connect is not going to require the admin or full access roles. So carefully consider what integrations you have in place and review what roles they are logging into NetSuite under. I would also strongly consider two-factor authentication for the admin and full access roles. For those that don't know, two-factor authentication requires 2 levels of security in order to log into NetSuite. It's basically something the user or something the user knows, which is going to be their username and password, and then something they have as well. So in this case, it can be a few different things. NetSuite supports both phone or RSA's secure ID tokens. So with phone, NetSuite's going to be sending SMS messages. So again, something the user has, in this case their phone. With RSA Secure ID, which does require additional configuration by NetSuite in order to enable. At that point, there's hardware in place that's going to grant these tokens that the user has to enter when they're logging into NetSuite. So again, something they have. Two-factor authentication can be enabled for specific roles. So I would highly suggest that it's enabled for your admin and full access roles. And then you can also specify the duration on how often they need to complete the full two-factor authentication to gain access to NetSuite. So you can set that duration per session or based on the number of hours or days. I would also suggest looking into IP address restrictions. With IP address restrictions, you can essentially say that users can only log into NetSuite from computers or from networks that you've set up in NetSuite. So you can go into NetSuite and set company-wide IP address restrictions to only allow all users to log into NetSuite using a specific set of computers or a specific network. If they're working from home in this case, they do need to be VPN'd if they don't have their home IP address entered into NetSuite. And then you can also set restrictions at the user level. So especially important with admin full access, if you have users with those roles, I would suggest thinking about IP address restrictions on those users. From an auditing standpoint, if you do have an excessive number of admin or full access users, this is usually a sign of poorly designed security. It's obviously the easier route to take. You don't have to dig in when designing your roles. If you just assign everybody admin full access, it's a little bit easier, but again, it opens you up to excessive risk, and auditors are going to know that something's probably wrong here. So it's important to take a look at orphan users as well. So orphan users are going to be users that are set up in NetSuite that should no longer have access to the system. So these could be users that were terminated, perhaps they changed jobs or they're on leave, but they should not actually have access to NetSuite anymore. So it's important in this case to understand what your processes are for when users leave, because that's really where you're going to catch this is up front in your processes, making sure that that access is removed when these users no longer need it. And then also just regular periodic review. Setting up save searches in NetSuite, determining the last time users logged in is something that's fairly easy to do to determine if you see users that have not been logging in for months at a time, probably somebody that should be orphaned. And then you can also look at other information on NetSuite, perhaps if you have start and end dates on the actual employee record. If there are orphaned users in your system, this is typically something that auditors are going to use to determine that they need to probably dig deeper into your processes. So customizations in place of security. One of the features of customization, so scripts and workflows and custom fields and records in NetSuite, is that you can programmatically build in additional security. So with both scripts and workflows, you can have those trigger when certain records are being accessed in NetSuite and actually have those check additional logic besides just the user's roles and permissions to determine if a certain user can access whatever is in that script or the record that's being, the record in context at that point. So it is one of the features, but there are not a whole lot of circumstances where that really needs to be in place. Auditors obviously are going to prefer that your security is correct and it's not just band-aids all over the place in the form of customizations that are specifying your security. And if that is the case, that can increase your audit costs because they're going to be around longer as they dig into these customizations a little bit further to determine what they're doing. If you do have scripts or workflows that are acting as additional security, like I said, there are circumstances where this can be necessary, but it's important to understand what the reason is behind that. It needs to be fully documented, so when your auditors come in and identify those issues, you need to be able to work through that process with them. So execute as admin. For those that don't know, this is a setting that can be made on both scripts and workflows. Essentially what it does is when that script or workflow runs, it will run under the role of the administrator. Essentially that script or workflow can then access anything available via script or workflows regardless of the current user's security context. So in other words, when a user does an action in NetSuite that is going to trigger that script or that workflow, it's going to elevate their security context, and it can potentially elevate it to administrator. However, this setting is only available to administrators, so you can't log in as any role and set a script to run as admin. You have to actually be logged in as administrator already. So it's important to understand, first off, which scripts or workflows have this setting in place, and then two, whether this setting is even necessary or not. Again, this is something that's often done, we see somewhat lazily. So developers, it's much easier for them to just set a script to run as administrator than it is to go through and do a thorough analysis on what permissions or what roles are needed in order to run that script. So we see that done, like I said, oftentimes because it's easy, but it's not typically necessary. If you do have scripts or workflows with this setting in place, highly recommend that you review your change management processes to understand who can make changes to those scripts or those workflows and how those customizations are being deployed to your production environments. So taking a look at your processes, so essentially we need to understand what all the processes you have within NetSuite and what documentation level you have for each process. Ideally, you should have documentation for every process, including the ability to walk it through from end to end, identifying any integrations or third-party systems that are involved, as well as any customizations that are involved. Auditors are going to want to know that organizations understand their processes and understand how they work, and really documentation is the easiest way to do that. So really, you need to consider third-party integrations that you have, and then customizations that are also included, because those can be big red flags. So really with everything here, the idea is that you need to take a risk-based approach. So you need to identify what areas are high risk for your organization. It may be different from organization to organization, and that's where you should be focusing come year end and also going into next year. It's a good idea to review all of your mitigating controls if they need evidence that they are indeed being performed. So have you been going in and reviewing access? Have you been going in and doing your segregation of duties analysis? And then with this year being at the end of the calendar year, it's probably too late to really fix significant issues. But the idea is to identify the proper scope, again risk-based, and take that into next year and start showing progress. At Fastpath, we do offer a few products to try and help you through this process. Just real quickly, I'll go through each of the modules within our Fastpath Assure product that does indeed work with NetSuite. First off, access reviews. So as we go back to user security, who has access to your system and what can they do? We provide some out-of-the-box reports that make this process a little bit easier and make it easy to assign risk as well to those permissions. Segregation of duties, so we take that complete picture of user access, their roles, their permissions, their global permissions, and provide a platform with a standard set of rules that our auditors have developed for NetSuite that you can use to analyze risk within your NetSuite system. Audit Trail, really we're providing an enhanced system notes reporting tool. So again, it's going back to the system notes that NetSuite themselves are maintaining within the system, and we provide a front end that makes that interface for interacting with those system notes a little bit easier. In identity management, good idea to take a look at your user provisioning tools, what you have in place that's working with NetSuite. We offer a tool that does SOD analysis up front prior to user provisioning, also with the ability to specify effective dates both on users as well as accesses, and it's a workflow-based tool. You can set up workflow groups and approval groups that can be used to push identity management requests through a series of approvals. Well, I hope this was helpful. Again, a lot of the key areas that need to be looked at coming into year end here are there there any questions from anybody? I don't see any right now, but we'll just give it a few minutes here, and then we'll end the presentation. I appreciate everybody taking the time to join. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Again, thanks everybody for jumping on, and have a good rest of your day.